Hello everyone. A zestful good evening to all the teammates and our top speaker, Miss Srinandini Nitin ma'am, and good morning to Shravan sir. I am Sindhuja, pursuing second year BTech in Food Technology Department. I extremely pleased to welcome you all for today's top talk. I hope everyone is doing good and safe. It's my pleasure to be a moderator for this session. Now let's start this session by providing the positive vibes, endurance, values with our invocation and gratitude story. Now I would like Pranit to tell invocation. Over to you, Pranit.
Thank you, Akaya. This is who we are. We are a team, talented, energetic, astonic mindsets. We can do anything and everything. We talk, we care, we respect each other. We see beauty in everything. We are connected by hearts and driven by values. We celebrate each other. We provide value to each other. We take ownership in everything we do. We have freedom to make mistakes. We learn as we go. We are mad to make difference. We love disruptive ideas. We make impossible things possible. We are strong to question the creation. We believe in dreaming big. If we do not dare to dream big, are we really living? Why be ordinary when we can be extraordinary? This is who we are. By Shivani Sirsagar. Thank you, Akra.
Thank you, Pranit. It's a good startup. Now I would like Madhu to tell a gratitude story. Over to you, Madhu.
Yeah. Thank you, Akka. We, the Top Gratitude team, is here with the exclusive gratitude story again. At the initial time of this project, I shared few cards to my near and dear people by showing gratitude for me, what they did till now. Just by the word thank you, they given me a special place in their hearts. I shared card to my best friend and relatives. Once they received, they called me and shown their enormous love towards me. I became emotional. Just the small card give me a wonderful memory and give me the special place in their life. By Sindhuja Akka.
Thank you, Madhu. Now let us get into it. I am so blessed to introduce our today's top speaker, Ms. Srinandini Nitin ma'am. Ma'am is currently working as lead engineer subsea umbilicals in Reliance Industries Limited. Ma'am completed her BTech in chemical engineering from Jawaharlal Nehru Technological University and MBA from Symbiosis Center for Distance Learning. Ma'am has almost 13 plus years experience gained in the offshore oil and gas industry working for KGD6 Basin. Ma'am has experience in multidisciplinary engineering and project management with a broad conceptual development through FEED, detailed design, construction, procurement, installation, testing, pre-commissioning, and commissioning. Ma'am also has a proficiency in conceptualization, detailed engineering, and project management of subsea umbilical systems, system engineering and subsea control system, solutions for oil and gas projects. It was a great pleasure to meet you, ma'am. Thank you so much for giving us today's top session. So how we can start? It will be an interactive session. If you want to give us a presentation, we can go with it, or we can go with a questionnaire. It's all over to you, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you, Sindhaja, for this wonderful introduction. And I'm happy to be here and to share my experience to all of you. I think an interactive session will be a little more, happy session since we are all on a weekend, on a Saturday evening, sitting in front of our laptops and wondering what's going to happen today. So what I'll do is, and in fact, I was just when somebody just mentioned, it's a content. Somebody was just mentioning in just before I speak that it's a continuous journey, and it's you give and take and you share. And when Nishita reached out to me yesterday, you won't believe. I'll show you what I've been doing. I've been writing what I have done all these days, what I have done for the last 13 years, what I can share. So what I'll do is I'll share my personal experience. I think that will be fun to know what I've been doing, and then we can take an interactive session with each of you. And should that be okay?
Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
First of all, I would like to even thank Meena ma'am who approached me and asked me if I can take up a session. I don't know if she's here on the call, but yeah, a big thanks to her for allowing an opportunity like this to connect with the youngsters. You start feeling young again. Uh, okay, a quick brief about me. My name is Sri Nandini Nitin Bhardwaj. I have done my chemical engineering and moved to Reliance Industries after I passed out from my chemical engineering in 2007. So yeah, it is a normal process with your exams and interviews, and I was lucky to get this opportunity. I'm working for the oil and gas sector in Reliance. So I am not sure how many of you know what oil and gas sector is and what E&P is all about. So I'll just touch base on what it is in a very brief overview, so that it is clear to you when I speak about what I enjoyed doing, what was the challenges I faced, and things like that. So oil and gas industry is a part of the energy sector. So nowadays we have all heard about renewable, non-renewable, and the different types of energy mixes, or how fuel is generated. So in the oil and gas, or in the exploration production department, it is mostly to do with subsea technology. That is, what oil and gas reserves we have in the deep waters. Okay, and Reliance has a blog. I mean, it is there in the internet. You can read and you can see what it is. It has a blog in the KGD6 basin, that is the Krishna Godavari basin, along the coast of Kakinada in Bay of Bengal. Okay, in the it's a, I mean, I don't know if you all know this place, Kakinada. It is in the Andhra Pradesh state, and there is a long coastal line there. So we usually work offshore in the Kakinada base. So so Reliance discovered this block, and there was a huge discovery and how to tap this potential. So the oil and gas business in Reliance Industries emerged somewhere in 2002, when this gas reserve was discovered. And then a team of engineers and other professionals required, like other professionals, when I mean it is the geologists, there are geoscientists, there are drilling and completions guys, a full team of drilling and completion, and then there is a subsea production projects team. So if you see the life cycle, it is, first you do a discovery, you see if there is, the geoscientists and the geologists, they do a discovery and they say, okay, here we have a potential of oil and gas. And then the drilling team comes in place, they drill some wells in subsea, and then they say, they validate the results given by the geologists or the geoscientists, that yes, there is a potential gas. And then there's a lot of economic studies that happens by the business team. Should we really invest so much of amount? Are we going to get enough gas or oil, and then we sell it to the market? What is the amount of potential that we have? Is it commercially viable to the company? So once this is established, and once the company, that is the top management of the company, decides that let us go in and do this project, that is when the projects team come into play. And that is when I, from the projects team, have a role to play. So this is the background. So so we have all established, okay, that there is an oil and gas reserve, and then it is a potential field that we can go and make our wells and our subsea infrastructure and lay pipelines and all the other infrastructure to draw the oil or gas from that reserve. So KG-D6 has been predominantly a gas reserve, and we were able to drill about 18, 19 wells in the last 10 years, 12 years, and have been successful successfully producing gas for Reliance and for the nation, I would say, because Reliance, as you all know, has been a boost to the GDP of the country itself. Okay, so this is all about the oil and gas sector. Now let's talk about projects, what we do or what I do in the projects team. So there is something called a subsea architecture. So we come up with a plan. It's, you can draw a parallel to, you have a piece of land, you want to build a house there, say you want to build a house, you want to build a 2 BHK or a 3 BHK. So you start planning. Okay, I need 3 BHK. I have a big space of land or a small space of land, because based on that you decide, okay, let's make a 2 BHK or a 3 BHK. And all those fancy things. Okay, let us have a garden and things. So you start planning for all that. So similarly, a project will also have, or rather a subsea architecture begins with a concept. Okay, this is what the drilling guys have told us, or the geologists have told us, that okay, this is the piece of land in subsea that you can put up this infrastructure to draw the gas in place. Okay, and then the project team comes up. Okay, let's have, say, 6 wells or 8 wells, and let's have a few pipelines connected to it, and let's have a platform where we can collect all this gas, commingle all this gas and bring it to a platform. Okay. And then from the platform you lay some more pipeline and to the land, and then it goes to a processing facility. From the processing facility, then it is then taken up by different, it is sent to the fertilizer industry, it is sent for power generation or a fuel for any industry. So pipelines are then laid to collect or transport these gas to different other sectors like fertilizer and power generation and things like that. So this is all about how the E&P as a from start to end. So a geologist discovers something, and all this chain happens, and then finally the end user is say a fertilizer industry or a power generation industry. Okay, so what I've been speaking so long can be clearly seen in this presentation here. Say there is a seashore or a coastline somewhere here, and we are in the deep waters here. So these are the different water depths we can see. The platform is, this is an illustration. You can search on the Google, you'll find lots of explanation on how these platforms are installed and how the subsea architecture is installed. So quickly, I will just tell you, say this is the surface, sea surface, and under the sea surface, you have different water depths, different topography. It is, there are different water depths. You see here, suddenly the water depth has drastically fallen from this point to this point. Okay, and you can see these yellow colored structures here. So this is something like a Christmas tree, and these are the pipelines, these are the umbilicals that is laid, and this is a platform. The pipeline collects all the gas from the Christmas tree to the platform. The platform then transposes it back to the land. Okay, so I'll give you a little more. So this is a very colorful picture, is a very graphical picture, I would say. If you see this is a little more real. In subsea, it's just a seabed here. You have a manifold or a Christmas tree, and then you have a flow line, umbilical. All these are installed in subsea. So say if we want, say, 6 wells to be drilled, so we'll have 6 XMTs and different locations in this area, and then we connect a lot of pipelines and jumpers and umbilicals, and a closer look of that would be something like this. And then once you operate the Christmas tree or operate the manifold, you can start producing from those fields. Now I will not go into how each structure is operated or how we draw oil and gas. So that will become a very technical session now. But yeah, there are a lot of these structures. In brief, I'll tell you that these structures have a lot of valve operations, a lot of ROV valves and hydraulically operated valves. When you open these valves, the oil and gas starts to flow into the pipeline, and then you collect it at the platform, and then onward to the onshore terminal. So now, how does the gas travel by itself? I think it is very basic science. Gas is under high pressure. It's compressed in the deeper layers of the Earth's crust, and it is in high pressure. So from high pressure potential to a low pressure potential, the gas travels by its own pressure potential difference or energy within stored within the gas itself or within the reservoir. And now let's talk about what I have been doing. So I have been part of this team and I've been working for the umbilical and the control system. So these, I don't know, it must be a very new term to all of you, or maybe you would have heard about it as well. But when I started, it was absolutely new and I just didn't know what these things were. So umbilical is basically, in a very layman term, it's like the charger to your laptop. Okay, so if you need your laptop working, you need your charger to be powering up your system. Okay, so umbilical is something that you need, that you lay. It's a cable. It's a bundle of cable which has tubes, electrical cables, fibers, bundled into a big cable, and it is laid in the subsea to power up the system. So when I told you about, there are a lot of valves within the system. Now, how do I operate the valves? At 2000 meter water depth, man cannot go. Man can go maximum up to 100 meter water depth. Okay, so you need power and signal and hydraulics to be supplied to that water depth, so that you can operate these valves and you can close and open and allow the gas to flow. Or if you think you need some maintenance, you want to shut down that part, you can close those valves, do a maintenance, do a hydrate mitigation, or whatever. That is all process related. So a lot of things happen in this process, in the production part of the life cycle of this project. So, but yeah, the provision to operate it, the provision to collect the data, understand what is the pressure, temperature, these are all very important parameters. Sometimes when gas is not producing, sometimes water starts coming in, sometimes sand starts coming in, because ultimately you're drilling into a reservoir, right, into the Earth's crust. So it can damage your system, or that's not what you want. You want gas to be producing. You want to get an indication that, okay, now gas has stopped producing. Now you need to do some mitigation. So for all these, you have a lot of sensors like pressure, temperature sensors, flow meters to give you the quantity of what is the flow rate that you're getting this. Then you have a lot, aqua watchers, or where you can determine that water is starting to come into your pipeline. It's not gas. So all these different kind of sensors are also there within the infrastructure or the structure that you have seen. Now to operate all this or to get the data back, if some pressure temperature transmitter is reading some data in subsea, how will you get it on the platform? You need a signal cable, or you need a fiber cable to feed that data back into your system or on the onshore land where you're sitting. So that is where my role comes, and how to build this umbilical, what are the requirements of this field, and how many umbilical cables do I need. All this is planning. Like we'll go back to planning the house. I need 2 bedrooms, I need 3 fans, I need 4 bulbs, or what it is. I need to provide all those, plan it and start providing it. So I need immediately, and okay, I need 4 bulbs, so I need 4 switches, I need 4 wires to be laid for these 4 bulbs at different locations. Okay, So very similarly, you conceptualize and then you go into detail engineering. Okay, now when you finalize that this is what it is, then you start manufacturing these components or these structures or components or something. Okay, so quickly I'll go back to my presentation. I spoke about this Christmas tree or this manifold. So just to give a feel, so this is the real Christmas tree that was installed in Subsea. So you can see, you can compare the size of this Christmas tree being carried by this truck. So you can see how massive this structure could be. And just sharing some more pictures from the offshore. So this is how the vessels are deployed offshore. You would have seen here in this first picture how the vessels are located at different places. So the vessels are deployed offshore, and a lift is happening between two vessels, and then it is installed subsea. So the crane takes it all the way down to this water depth and then installs it here in its location, and then they start laying the pipeline. So this is just for you to give you a feel of how the things happen. You can see a lot of pipes being stacked here. So the pipe, each and every pipe will be lifted, welded, and installed. I mean, it will be laid subsea. A lot of people working here. So this is all this action is happening in Bay of Bengal, in the middle of the sea. As you can see, a couple of people standing here, a couple of people standing here, the crane operators talking to each other, picking up a product, picking up a structure. And you can see how massive or how huge this structure is and how colorful and nice it is seen here. So it's what I'm trying to highlight here. It is just a very massive, it's a mega scale projects. Oil and gas projects are all mega scale projects, and it's a very interesting and exciting industry to work with.
Can I ask a question, Nandini?
Yeah, please.
So is this kind of activity happening all the time?
No, it does not happen all the time. It does not happen all the time. So I'll just give you a brief on that. So once you feel that the potential, I mean, the business team and top management takes a decision that there is a potential in this area to develop this field. So only then a project comes into place. So we've had about 3 projects within Reliance in the last 10 years. So you can see how massive it is. So it is just 3 projects in 10 years. So each project lasts almost about 2 to 3 years for it all to come into shape and to start producing. And proudly to say, Reliance is one of the fastest company to complete this project in a record time of say 18 months to 2 years. So keeping in mind that the offshore weather is one of the biggest constraints. Because of this weather condition in offshore, you have a lot of cyclones and winds, and which does not allow you to install these structures as smooth as it is seen here. So this is one of those days when the weather is very smooth and nice. But otherwise, if the weather is harsh or the weather condition is so bad that you cannot lift it so smoothly, then you cannot do it. So to summarize everything, the project happens in the early months of like say December, early weeks of December to mid-May, or even sometimes mid-May is also very rough weather in the East Coast. So by June, all the vessels move out of the field. There are no vessels working. So it's about that window of 4 to 5 months, December to May, or maybe sometimes even April, that all this activity has to be complete. So this is the activity I'm talking in offshore. But prior to this, when this all has to be manufactured, all these components that we see here in the subsea architecture, all this has to be manufactured at different locations, and it is all manufactured at various parts of the world. Something is manufactured in Malaysia, something in the United States, something in the European countries, and they all are then transported to the location. Here, in this case, it is Kakinada. So all these also take a lot of time. So once all these are at the site in Kakinada, the vessels arrive the Kakinada, the Bay of Bengal waters somewhere in the early December or late November. That's when the project actually kicks off for its final construction phase. So there are different phases. This is the final construction phase where these structures are actually installed subsea. So this action happens, or the subsea action rather, I would say, happens 5 to 6 months, or maybe 4 to 5 months. After which we are hopeful that we start producing sufficient uh, oil or gas from the field. Does that answer your question, sir?
Yes. Thank
Okay. No problem. Yeah, So I spoke about umbilicals. So again, putting it in a very layman, very simple terms, umbilical is nothing but this kind of a yellow cable that you can see. It's a very far taken shot, so it's not as small as you see here. It's about 200 or 300 in diameter. Okay, and each of these umbilicals have different tubes, cables, and fiber optics, all these things bundled into this umbilical. And this is a vessel that has to install this umbilical. So this is about 60 kilometers of umbilical is spooled into this basket of this vessel, and you start laying it from one end, and then you keep laying it as per the design or as per what your architecture is. Something like this. If you see here, the umbilical is installed on the structure, and then you continue to lay it. Say you keep laying it until you reach your platform or however your architecture is. Yeah, you can see this. This is another beautiful shot. While we were working in the KGD6 basin, and I don't know if any of you can spot me. I'm standing somewhere here. Okay. So this is the basket I was talking about. This is about 60 kilometers of umbilical. So this is the head. This is the it's like a plug, you can see, head, where you have to connect it to the structure. So it is lifted onto this this arch kind of a chute, where you have to start laying it down into the subsea, and slowly the product is slowly laid into the sea, and something like this. When you start connecting it into one of the structure that is already, this would have been already installed in this case. So you install the umbilical head onto the structure and then continue to lay. Just to give you a feel of how large scale or the magnanimity of these projects are, especially the vessel, the size of the vessel, and I especially picked up this photo for you to see, that you can see men standing here, or I don't even know if I'm visible somewhere here, but you can see some personnel standing here, some people standing here and here. So you see what is the difference of the huge crane and the huge lay tower and the size of the people. So it is just a comparison for you. Okay, that's some pictures of me. Just to show you that I was there. And this is the umbilical reel, and this is some other infrastructure. This is the lay tower that we had already seen so far. This is basically me on duty in supervising the installation, everything goes well, and I was the client side, company side representative. So I was representing Reliance on this vessel. I was there for about a month or so, and then whenever project demands, it's about a month's time that you have to be offshore. So that is me, in one of the inspections that I was doing really late in the night. It was about 1 or 2 o'clock in the night when I had to go and check the pressures in the line. You can see some pressure gauges here, and yeah. This is a picture I just put here to tell you that I'm not always here like this, or I'm not always dressed in my coveralls in the middle of the sea. So I work in an office setup like this, where we do all the pre-activities, the activities that has to go into place before we actually start, installing the subsea activities like I just mentioned. Um, so it's not that I'm always dressed in my coveralls and standing somewhere in the middle of the sea. So we do a lot of somewhere Sindhuja was mentioning about conceptualizing, feed, detail engineering. So all these activities are engineering activities that has to be done from office. You decide what is your layout. Try to place purchase orders for all these, procure all these items, give it to different specialists who manufacture these kind of big structures and umbilicals and pipelines. And then it's a big process. There's lots of things happening. You have to find the best vendor or the best contractor for you who can provide those huge vessels, the huge vessels that you're seeing. Some vessels can install umbilical, some vessels can install pipeline, some vessels cannot do these things, but they can install the big massive structures that these are as big as a truck or a lorry that you can see. And then they should have the capacity to install in 2000 meters of water depth is one of the deepest project in the world, and a lot of challenges. Lot of challenges happen. Sometimes the material doesn't come on time, sometimes the weather is not good, sometimes. And this is all the last part, the only the construction part. And when you start talking about detail engineering and this is how we want it to be, this is how this is the pressure, this is the temperature, this is the kind of reservoir that we have. So maybe we need to inject some kind of chemical, some kind of corrosion inhibitors. So when that kind of a requirement comes, then what you have to do, you have to include more tubes in your umbilical, because the tubes will carry the hydraulics, the chemical inhibitors, or whatever it is into the subsea. So it's a back and forth, how you design. So the design, the detail engineering before manufacturing is very important. Once you start manufacturing, you cannot keep on adding things. It has to be a full-fledged structure. You cannot keep on changing it. It's become very difficult. So all this brainstorming and everything happens in a very early phase. Then you start manufacturing this. Different contractors manufacture it, and then you test those products before all these equipments and structures. You test them before it is actually deployed. You don't want something to go subsea and not working, right? You don't want to bring your laptop home and see, oh, it's not working. So you will check it in the showroom and test it in the showroom and see if everything is okay, and then bring it. So it's very similar to that. So, and you also will ask for, what is warranty and guarantee, kab tak chalega, any రోజులు పనిచేస్తాయి, or whatever. So all those things, so that is also happening in this kind of projects. It's, you can compare every time, or do this in your day-to-day life. So that is all about me and what I have been doing all this while, and I can keep on talking. So I will not go on to what the project is and how things happen in the project. But yeah, I would like to, I think when I was contacted, what Nishita told me was, we want to know how has been your journey, what has been you doing. So that's what I was showing you. I've been writing, what have I been doing or what have I learned. So I will have to use my notes to see what all I've been scribbling throughout the day. So some really important things or aspects that I have been following as I kept going up the ladder, or when I joined as a GET, I had no clue of what to do, how to do, and I did take help of all my seniors. I reached out to them. I asked them for help and to guide me, to handhold me, and I had wonderful colleagues as well. So when I joined, there were about four other girls with me. And in 2007 or 2008, a decade back, a woman in the offshore industry was very rare. Is I would start off thanking my first manager, my first boss when I joined Reliance. When three girls, just we don't know anything, we just went and like, we want to go offshore. Okay, that's what was. And then the boss just smiled. My manager, he just smiled. It's not an easy thing to go offshore. You have to either take a chopper or a helicopter, or you have to go in a chota sa crew boat. And I was told at that time, people who have worked for 7, 8 years, 5 years also have seasickness in large vessels where the movement of the vessel is relatively nil. You just feel it. Imagine a small thing like me going on a crew boat, and he was very, very apprehensive. The amount of responsibility he has as a manager to send me or a couple of my colleagues or 3, 4 of us. And then there is this stigma about women. Oh, women. Oh, yaar, ladki ne bola. How can we send her? But thankfully, my manager, my first boss, he was very positive. He asked the four of us, the four girls in our batch, to undergo the underwater training. So there is an underwater training that we need to undergo. If somebody is interested to know what all these things are, we can connect offline. We can connect. I think my number is available, so we can connect offline. But yeah, so there's an underwater training. There's a training before firefighting, helicopter training. All these things that you need to undergo before you actually go offshore. So the first time we decided, our boss told us, okay, you book a slot for that training. It's about a 3-day or a 4-day training, sometimes 5-day training. You go and do it. And we went there as if we thought, well, it's a training, let's go and do it. So it's not just a training. It is something, it is everything you need before you go offshore. Okay. Offshore is not like, if something happens, you can just come running back home. So it is, if you're in the middle of the sea, you have no connectivity, you need to know what you need to do to survive. So we have firefighting, we have, if something happens to the vessel, it is something, how you jump out of the vessel into the sea, okay, and how you help your other mates in the vessel, and how all these things. I mean, you all might have traveled through aeroplanes or through flights. Not in last 1 year, but yeah, sometime before that. So they would always tell you, wear your jacket and wear that belt, and you have those nozzles. So all that is also a part of our training. That if the chopper has to land somewhere in water, or now if it has to land somewhere in water is a very funny thing. It is all water around, so it will land in water only. Okay, so. Or if something happens, I've heard stories of some of my colleagues saying that the chopper rotor blade, it just stopped in between when they were flying from the land to the vessel. So all these different stories are so interesting and so motivating. So and then we had this training. We had undergone this training, and we were sent offshore. And that's how my journey began. And then ever since, I've been an offshore engineer, a subsea engineer. Now coming back to how to progress, and how I mean, what next? Okay, now I've got into that stream, or I've started being in the project team. What next? So there are two things that I learned from my seniors, or through the process, rather. One thing was definitely, goal setting. What is goal setting? And what, I mean, you see 3 years down the line, 2 years down the line, where you are, and now, and where you want to be then, or say 5-year plan, something like that. And then there will be a gap between these two. What are the skills you need to be there, and what are the skills you have now. You make a plan and you start working on improving those plans, those skills. Okay. Some of the key skills I think everybody would know is communication, networking, business writing. So this, as you come into the system, you start improving. Okay. So communication, I don't want to go into length and depth of it. It's a very, very important skill, and it is something. And I say it is a skill because it can be developed. Okay, I have done it for myself. I know it can be developed. It's not that somebody is really good at communicating. No, that means somebody has worked on their communication skills. Okay. So it starts with to be able to communicate is very important, because you might say something, but did the receiver perceive the same thing is very important. Okay, are you able to communicate what is in your mind is very important. So communication is very important. So that is one very important thing throughout, whether you are just joining or whether you are the head of a department or whatever. It is a very important skill. So it's all starts by that you should be a good listener. Okay, you should be able to listen. And I mean, what are things that I have done is I have been a good listener in my younger days. Try to shadow somebody you think can be your mentor. Okay, this person is my mentor, let me shadow that person, or let me work with that person, and let me see if I am able to develop the skills or acquire what he's trying or he or she is trying to teach me, and then start to put into action. Now when you start putting into action, this again connects back to your goal setting. Okay, so you are here, you want to be there, and what is the gap between the two? You need you have identified those gaps, and you need to start acting on those. So your action starts once, see, your action is connected back to your goal setting. Okay, so that is one very important thing. Another thing was, business communication. Okay, that is something that once you come into the system, you will come to know what business communication is. Another very important thing was time management. And when I joined Reliance, and when I started working in the offshore industry, I realized how massive things could be, and how some things you need to solve it. Problem solving would be in the next hour or in the next 30 minutes, and some things would be okay, this can come later or something. So that's when one of our sessions long back, they taught us to this Eisenhower principle. Okay, it is a time management principle where it's like a quadrant. It's like 4 quadrants, and you have what is important and what is urgent. Okay, so you have two axes where you have what is important and what is urgent. So when you have this 4 quadrants, you know that what is most important and urgent, that is what you have to attend to first. So when you make this quadrant, you'll have important, urgent, important, not urgent, not important, not urgent, and important, not urgent. So you'll get this 4 quadrants. Now, once you get these 4 quadrants, you'll be able to put into these quadrants, if you are able to put into these quadrants, or, again, do not shy from asking anybody. If you are in doubt, ask. That is the first thing we are taught. That is the first thing we are taught when we are in offshore also, just even before you go offshore. If you are in doubt, you have to ask. There is nothing like a silly question. There's nothing like a silly, silly doubt or whatever. It's always better to clarify as early as you can. So the moment you start putting these blocks, the filling up these blocks, you'll be able to channelize your time. You'll be able to channel, this is something you have to do first. This is something I can push it on the later date. Okay, or this is something, I may not pay attention right now, but yeah, it is something that is important. So important, not urgent. So these kind of, task blocking, block your task based on its importance and its urgency. And then you will be able to, smoothly transact from the time management will be very very smooth when you transact through these kind of tools. The tools has to aid you. So this Heisenhower blocking method, or this time management is one of the easiest tool that you can use, and the tool has to help you. It does help you. Okay, and I still use it for that matter. Okay, so I think these are some of the things I have been doing, and things. Uh, and one other thing is always have the hunger and desire, and keep that mindset open. Ki, let's do something more. Let's do something different. Let's do something that can add value. Okay, so always have the mindset that I have to do something that can add value. Okay, not just doing something without aim and focus. Then you are just doing something. But when you have an aim, when you have a focus, and you know that I have to add value, and when your mind is driven with that hunger and desire, you automatically start doing things, or trying to figure out ways how to come there, or how to get into that groove, and how I can be a part of the system, or where am I today and where I need to be in 5 years. All that comes from that mindset. So I think I have been doing all this, and it has been working well for me all this time. And I think I am happy with the way it works for me. So I'll open it to you all for any questions or anything you would like to know on any topic I've been speaking, or I'm happy to help on anything else you think I can help you with.
Nandini, I have a question. This is first of all, thank you very much for doing this presentation, and I have learned quite a bit from this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
See, when like you said, a lot of people get seasickness.
Yeah.
So, what all 4 of you or 5 of you who decided to take this training, did you have seasickness, or none of you had seasickness?
No, we were 4 of us who were allowed to go offshore, and I don't know if it is recorded somewhere, but it may not be official. But we were told that we were one of the first women to go offshore, the 4 of us. And we went with all our medical kit, whatever was supplied to us from our HSC officer. And we had this pill that we had to take before. So since it was a seasickness pill that we have to take before, about a couple of hours before we actually board a crew boat or a chopper, we'll have to take that. So we were all so scared and so naive at that time. I just popped the pill and I was waiting. So I don't know whether I actually suffered a seasickness. But then, yeah, a couple of times, yes, a couple of times when we were in the sea in between a construction activity, the sea swell was about 15 meters. So the vessel went 15-meter high and low. So those days, yeah, definitely I was seasick. And this is way back in 2008. I was severely seasick. 2 of us, 2 girls went for the first time. So when we went, when we were traveling from the shore to the offshore, we did not have any issue. Because maybe it was the effect of the pit.
Did you go on the small boat from the offshore to this, or did you take the helicopter?
I took the chopper, the helicopter.
Okay. Because we were on the cruise, and at one place, the government, one of the Caribbean governments didn't allow the cruise ship to come closer. So we had to take this small boat and get to the coast. That's it. It was so hard. It was only like, 10 minutes maybe.
Yeah.
Then it felt like 10 years to me. And everyone was throwing up. We had these bags that were given to us.
Yeah, sickness
we had
bag.
a choice between using a bag or the pill, the tablet. And I said, no, you know what? I think I can manage this. And luckily I managed it, but it was not easy at all. So we were all, so I didn't find I don't think I found anyone in the whole boat who were not seasick. Almost everyone was seasick. So that's why I was asking you whether. So since you are taking the tablet, I think it did prevent you from getting seasick.
This was now I'm much more used to. Now I don't take a tablet. I'm not seasick anymore. But if I feel I'm seasick, there's no harm in taking the tablets. It's a very mild sedative kind of tablet. So
Right.
earlier, definitely my first, second rides, whether it was the first ride was a chopper ride, then I had a couple of crew boats and then a couple of basket transfers. So basket transfer is a transfer from a vessel to the other vessel using a basket. I don't know if I could show that somewhere in the presentation.
Nandini, what about the time that you were pregnant?
No, that time we are not allowed to go.
Okay,
Sure.
there are rules for that. Okay.
Yes, there are rules. Yeah.
All right. Okay.
If you can see this basket behind me here. This basket can house about 6 people. We have to all hold this red color bar here, and then this is lift with a crane, something like this. The crane is then lift from here and put into this, or lift from here and put into this, depending on where you want to transfer people or material or whatever it is. So the crew boat, this is like a supply boat. It comes along the main construction boat. So there are rules, you need to maintain 300-meter, 200-meter gap, and then, or if it has to come somewhere less than 50-meter, then there are a lot of other drills that happen before a vessel comes so close. So many things, so much of engineering and calculations.
When I look at some of these things, I look at how amazing human beings are, that they could invent so many things. And then sometimes I look at human beings and think how stupid we all could be also at the same time.
I think somebody was asking about seasickness. What is seasickness? Seasickness is, I think Nandini should explain that.
Oh, no problem. It's a very normal term. Seasickness is the imbalance that is created in your body. In your your body has a body fluid that keeps you balanced, that keeps your nervous system and your digestive system balanced. So when you start, when you are on a vessel or on a boat, or which keeps going up and down and left and right, so it's all pitching and rolling in the sea. The entire system, the fluid system in your body starts to, all shake up things. And at that time, your mind and body is all nothing is coordinated. And you skip that balance. You are not able to, balance all those fluids in your body. So you start to throw up. So that is seasickness. It's like you have a bottle full of water and you keep shaking it without a cap and everything starts to spill out, right? So the body fluids start to come out, or you start to vomit. That is seasickness. It's not a nice thing, not a pleasant scene.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much. Such a beautiful pictures, like how amazing human beings are and how amazing chemical engineers are. So thank you, ma'am. So I can feel that like chemical engineering is called as universal field of engineering. So I think this is why we call it as universal. It is everywhere. Thank you for that.
Ma'am, do we get oil and liquid combinedly through those pipes, or is there a separation mechanism in the underground which separates there and pumps it?
Yeah, that's a nice question. Actually, when you determine the characteristics of a reservoir, you also get a sample. When the first well is drilled, it's called an appraisal well. It's just to know what is the actual content in that reservoir. So is it a condensate, or is it a gas mixture, or is it oil condensate? So once you get the sample, you determine whether it is an oil, a gas, or a gas condensate field. So if it is an oil field, then your extraction mechanism is totally different. So you have the same setup, you have the same subsea architecture, the structures, and then you have a methodology to bring the entire fluid onto the platform. And in the platform, this is called crude. crude oil. Okay, so it comes with all the debris, all the cuttings of the drilling pipes, the drilled pipes and things like that. So all this debris comes onto the surface, and then you do a processing on the surface like you would do in any no, with any distillation column or any separator process. That is done. So within Reliance, it is done on a very big vessel, or it is done in the onshore when these pipes transport the entire fluid, whatever produced fluid, to the onshore terminal. The terminal then processes it to a point where it can be ready for use, or it can be supplied to a power industry or a fertilizer industry. So and sometimes, depending on what type of gas it is, if you have a sulfur field, then you have to treat it in a different way. If you have carbon dioxide in the field, and carbon dioxide is being transported, so that can be risky because it can spark, and it can give you, because it has oxides in it. Okay, oxygen can release at pressure and temperature. At high pressure and temperature, it can break the molecule. So in that condition, you treat it slightly differently. So depending on what your reservoir is, or the fluid in your reservoir, the production that you are going to get from your reservoir, uh, uh, it nothing is done subsea. In subsea, it is only collecting it, putting it in through the pipeline, managing the pressure temperature so that you don't have a disruption on the shore, and then slowly transporting in a controlled fashion to the onshore terminal. And based on the produce, you have different processing facilities available to clean up the fluid and distillate it and separate the oil, the gas, the water.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Okay.
Shivani Akka, you can go ahead.
Yeah. First of all, thank you so much, ma'am, for coming and coming and giving such a wonderful talk. And your smile is very beautiful.
Thank you.
I have I don't listen to lectures. Like most of the times, I feel like they are very boring. And when you like were telling, I was just into it. Like I was listening everything you are saying. Not like it is not that uh, like uh, the way you told is very interesting, ma'am. And like being a woman, you did it. That is another plus point which inspired me to attend this session. And thank you, Mina ma'am, for introducing us to ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am. Like I want to ask, like, how did you how can we can go into Reliance or something? How did you get into it?
How to get into Reliance? It is, I don't know how can I answer that question, but yeah, definitely look out for the notices for the entrance exams, or if there is any vacancies open. For GETs, I think it is basically through the entrance exam only. So look out for that. Apply, prepare yourself for those exams. And it is not, it's not Reliance as such. If whichever company you would like to, or please look out for all the companies. There are oil and gas the ONGC is there. There is I think which one is that? Indian Oil is there, and there are many other oil and gas companies. So please look out for their. Sorry.
I think HPCL also is there. No?
HPCL, yeah, HPCL, BPCL, Indian Oil. Reliance is a private player, but yeah, you have all these other oil and gas companies.
Anthony, I just want to mention here, private players are daring to experiment with utilities and all that. That's what I found.
Yes,
because
yes.
When I was very young and I applied for these oil companies, they never bothered to even answer me. Like they told girls need not apply. So
yeah, exactly. Yes, correct.
I don't know. I don't think much has changed now, though. They do take and all of you students, you remember Badal, my batchmate Badal.
Yes, ma'am.
She was a chemical engineer and she was working in ONGC. She was given some safety jobs, I think, not actually field jobs.
Oh.
So Reliance is daring, a little more. I mean,
Yeah.
private companies are a bit more daring, and they're more organized also for such things. They take care of the engineers. If they are putting them in a dangerous job, they will also take due care.
Yeah.
So I would suggest if the girls are interested, you should actually reach out to private companies to get the
Yeah, that's
excitement.
true. But you know, from my own experience, I can share one other thing. Instead of going to a client company directly, I would say spend a couple of years in a contractor company, a company that makes or manufactures or has these fleet of vessels, who owns these vessels, or maybe a step behind, manufacturers who make the subsea structures, or any field that you choose to try to be on the contractor side for a couple of years. That gives you more exposure and more learning.
Do
No
you have
doubt.
any names of any companies like that which you can just give a sort of thumbs up to the girls? I mean, the students.
Yes, I can. Right now, off my head, I can say there is a BHG, Baker Hughes GE. This is they have commingled to become one company now. Then there is Technip FMC, Technip Energies. Um, and then there is Arca Solutions. So maybe I can just put a list of some companies and share it with Nishita.
Yeah.
Nishita has my number, so I can share it and she can pass it on to you.
That's nice. That'd be nice.
Yeah.
Yes.
So these are some companies that are from the contractor side. And why I say contractor side is because they have to do the work from scratch, from making a plate and then making a structure out of all these material is work from scratch. And the benefit of being in a client side company is that you are more exposed to management jobs. Know how a business decision is taken, how project management happens, how procurement happens, how you bring value to the company, how you take those decisions, those financial decisions. It's not always financial for us, but we need to provide a lot of technical support to our finance team. Okay, because finance team is at the end of the day going to ask you, do you require this for our field? Do you require this for our project? Is it an important expense, or is it something that a contractor is trying to sell you? All these things is all that you learn in a client company. But I would still say, you choose to work in a contractor company for a couple of years. Just 2-3 years, 4 years should be good, and then you move to a client company. It gives you a much more weightage. That's my learning. But if you have hunger and desire, you can learn anywhere.
Sure, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. I am Nikhil. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much for coming forward to let us know about your experience, and also you really made every one of us feel like knowing something different in a different way. Thank you so much. Thank you, Meena ma'am and Shawan sir. I have two different ways of two different questions basically. So the first one is as you mentioned about the umbilicals and all, what kind of concepts on, do you use any softwares?
Yeah. Yes.
So you use softwares to optimize, ma'am?
Yeah, there are softwares that are used to build this umbilical as such. Okay, so one basic software is the AutoCAD. In the AutoCAD, you can make the drawing, and then you can see how the measurements and how it physically will look once you start manufacturing it. But before that, before you come into how it starts to look, or how what shape it starts to take, or how many tubes and fillers or whatever component is there within the umbilical. But before that, you actually need to know how many tubes you need, how many cables you need, and how and what sizes they are going to be. So for all these, you need analysis. Those analyses are carried out in MathCAD. Then there is a software called Orcaflex. There's a software called Ambisys. Okay, it's like HISYS, but for umbilicals, Ambisys. So this is all a very, they are not a free softwares. They are not freely available in the open market. They are all licensed, and they are all have their own IP. So they are all developed by the manufacturers. I mean the companies who manufacture the umbilical itself, they have these softwares. So as Reliance, we don't use those softwares, or as a project team, we don't use those softwares. But we verify once they use the software and they come up with the product. They share those details to you, and we verify the engineering aspects, the design aspects, whether it meets our requirement, all that is verified from our side, from the client side. But yeah, to answer your question, yes, softwares are used to design and to first to do the analysis and then to design the product.
So basically, what kind of subjects or the concepts are mostly involved in oil and gas industry, like mass transfer operation or process dynamic control? What are the main subjects, ma'am? Like, are there any?
No, it's not a very process-driven field. It's more like it's more of mechanics, mechanical field. Within the chemical engineering scope, you have hydraulics, you have flow assurance. Okay, so hydraulics is like from top side to subsea. If I want to operate a valve, how much of fluid I need, at what pressure I need, at what rate I have to start pumping the fluid from top, so that a particular valve operates. So you need to get the data of that valve and how much fluid that valve requires to open or to close, and in how much time it will open or close. Now, the time is defined by the flow assurance process. Okay, so flow assurance is one very important field which revolves around chemical engineering with flow rates, pressure, temperature, with the type of flow. Okay, can it be a smooth laminar flow, or is it very turbulent, or can it form hydrates in its flow path? And if there is, if there, you saw the seabed is all up and down here. So there can be chances where a pipeline goes down and then comes up. So there can be chances that, if there can be gas pockets forming in that sag bend, or there can be some kind of a deposit there. So how do you push out that? So all that comes into flow assurance. What is that chemical, or what is that corrosion inhibitor that you want to inject, so that you can flush all these out from these bends, and there is no corrosion happening in that bend area. Because seabed is not going to be flat and clean for any project. So it will have all these kind of challenges. So chemical engineering, whatever you're going to learn now, is all applied in these areas of oil and gas industry in the projects field. But in the operations maintenance field, or when you are running the field for say 15 years or 20 years, then you have to again maintain all the parameters correctly. You see, you have to note the flow rate, the wet gas. I mean, the gas is giving you a particular flow rate, and you have expected this flow rate. So you have to analyze the pressure going down, the temperature going up. So what are those troubleshooting that you need to do? That all comes from your pressure, volume, temperature calculations, and how. So that is done by the operations field. So once the project is complete, you hand it over to the operations team, and operations team is then taking care of how to run the field. So in that part of oil and gas industry, again a lot of chemical engineering subjects are used, especially pressure, volume, temperature calculations.
Okay, thank you. And the other side of the question is, like, you mentioned about the energy field, recently I heard Mukesh Ambani mentioning in the AGM meeting about hydrogen energy. Like, do you know anything about it, the area, what they are working on, like something?
The idea, I mean, at least Vision 2035, you might have seen in that, is to have a net carbon zero for Reliance. So now everybody is moving towards clean energy, green energy. So hydrogen is one potential. So solar is one potential. So these are the guidelines laid out to us as a company that going forward 2035, if Reliance has to be a net carbon zero, hydrogen, solar, these will be the clean energy pockets that you have to think of and invest or come up with projects in these fields. So that is just a directive that we have now. Now we will start planning, or not me, it will come from the higher ups, from the management team. And then once it comes down to the projects team, then we will go ahead. So right now it is in a very concept stage.
Great to hear that, ma'am. All the best for Radiance.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Seems to be Dhanush has a question. Dhanush, you can go ahead.
Hello, ma'am.
Hello.
Ma'am, as you are working on the offshore, may have different kind of. I mean, ma'am, can I speak in Telugu?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, ma'am. You you have different kind of disadvantages. As you said that you are managing one of the deepest project, which 2,000 meters below, which may affected by lot of natural. Sorry, ma'am. We can say no, sir, natural forces, and also most of deepest aquatic animals may also affect your processing mechanism. I have listened that a small oil spit can also break a or make a large gas of pollution, as we seen in different countries, leads to ecosystem damage. As a project worker and a manager, how you face the different kind of problems during your work time?
Okay. Thank you, Dhanush. That is a environmental based question. I understand. You want to know how the marine life and how the oil and gas life are maintaining balance, and how the oil and gas project is not disturbing the ecosystem, or the marine ecosystem rather. The first thing, before a project begins, there's always an HSC plan that is in place. And there is another study that is carried out that is called ENVID, Environmental Hazard Identification. So when we are in the process of starting up these projects, or when we know that okay, we are going ahead with these projects, all these philosophies, these methodologies are put in place. A geotechnical survey is done. So if we say okay, this is our area that we have to go into subsea and start our construction activity, we do a geotechnical survey that is done by the geology team, and they give us the report that this is how your seabed looks like. This is how it has, the ups and downs, and how the seabed surface actually is. Then they also come up saying in the report showing that these are the pockets where the soil is very soft, or the type of soil in this area is sturdy, or a leveled surface. All the different geotechnical aspects about the seabed is identified in the survey. Then there is an environmental hazard identification that is done, and based on the outcomes, there are a lot of mitigative outcomes that are suggested in this. So if there is an oil spill, how much of oil spill has happened, and what is the immediate plan of action you have ready in place. Okay, so that is described in that ENVID report. That report will tell you this is what you have to do if the volume of oil spill is this, within this quantity to this quantity. So this is all an after activity that you need to do. So supposing an oil spill occurred, then you will do this. So, but in the design phase itself, you try to implement, the within your infrastructure, within your architecture, to ensure that an oil spill does not happen, or a gas leak does not happen. Okay, so things like having a double blocking system, things like having additional sealing. Wherever there are connection between two systems, you try to have more seals. a seal that is between the structure and the atmosphere or and the subsea environment. The seal, the double blocking systems are applied within the design itself. So when I'm going and installing a structure, the structure is built with these seals so that you have minimum exposure from the subsea to the producing system. So those things are taken care of during the design stage itself.
Okay, ma'am.
Is that
Thank you, ma'am.
understood? Yeah.
Yes, sir. Being facing the every problem for every minute and completing the task is the greatest and extraordinary job you have working for almost 15 years. We are pleasant and amazing to listen all your experiences, how you work, how you faces. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dhanush. Dhanush, you actually started off by saying, "Can I speak in Telugu?" And you actually kept speaking in English. So I appreciate you for that effort.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dhanush. Thank you, ma'am. Meena ma'am raised the hand.
Yeah.
Yes.
I just wanted to know the software and hardware that you're talking of, how much part of it is imported and how much is indigenous? Is it increasing? Indigenous share of these components is increasing?
Indigenous is increasing. Yes. In the last 5-6 years, I have seen it increasing more than what we had when we started. The first project we started in 2007-8. But till date, now what is happening is actually all of these major contractors or the who are more proven. I mean, their systems are already installed subsea, because subsea is something that you cannot every day go and intervene.
Yes.
It's not like I can just turn off a knob and see if the line is closed or something like that. So it's always recommended to have
Tested.
a prudent, and a contractor that has been approved worldwide. So we have so now of late, what has happened in the last 5-6 years is, with ONGC coming up as strong as like never before. They are also having different platforms in the East Coast. These contractors are also setting up their offices in India, employing Indian workers. Like, they have Indian staff, the engineers, the managers, all levels of people are all Indian, locally sourced resources. So even though the company as a brand is an MNC or is a global brand, uh, like Baker Hughes is having an office in India, McDermott is having an office in India, and they also employ Indian people.
Okay. My question was to understand whether the youngsters of today will get opportunity to develop software for these
Yes.
units, and also fabricators and industry in our country, whether they get the opportunity to take up fabrication and
Fabrication not yet. Definitely fabrication not yet, because like I told you, these kind of highly specialized structures.
reliability, because of reliability, safety.
Yes. The only proven vendors are employed for this job. Southeast Asia is a big hub. Southeast Asia has a lot of, in fact, there are a lot of Indians who are working in Southeast Asian fields or yards for these contractors. But in India, we don't have a yard so far that is actually manufacturing. We have pipeline yards. Just the pipeline is being built in Gujarat and in Rajkot and somewhere in Vizag. But for subsea usage, all the manufacturing happens in Europe or in the northern part of UK, in US, and mostly in Southeast Asia. The yards are all in Southeast Asia. And the other reason is also because the way it is geographically located, they can actually make those big structures in the yard and put it onto a cargo vessel alongside the yard itself, and then bring it to Kakinada or wherever the project is happening.
No, I was more I'm looking at in what way India is growing in this field. Would Reliance and similar companies give opportunity to Indian industry, even if they come forward and say, we'll meet all your safety criteria, we'll meet all your, inspection, the qualification criteria. So would these companies give an opportunity for small
Yes.
components to start with, then go on to bigger units?
Yes, there are some areas within the entire project system may not be subsea, but on the platform. On the platform, we wanted to install a DCS system, the control system, which was supplied by Schneider, and we had sourced the entire system, the interconnection between the top side and the subsea. Everything was done by the Indian crew from Schneider. It was procured by Schneider in Chennai itself, and all the equipments, components, everything was from Schneider, Chennai, and was installed in the offshore platform. So yes, different sectors. Different departments like subsea. Not yet. I would say that no prudent contractor as of now. But again, components within subsea, like if you want to have a pressure metering gauge or a chemical metering gauge, so those components we still have a workshop or a base and that is more like after sales, like an after sales base in India, but manufacturing not yet.
Okay.
Here and there we have Siemens doing some work. Here and there we have Cameron doing some work. But most of the engineering happens in India, and manufacturing is happening in other parts.
Okay. So all these students should be listening to this and noting that there are huge opportunities to have startups which manufacture. If you can compete with those giants.
And that's not only in the oil and gas industry. It's in if you innovate and think, you can have it in any industry.
Yeah, but the way the our government is stressing on having most of the components indigenous,
Yeah.
in our department, for example, they have told us that at least 70% of the components should be indigenous. We have no choice. Now it's very tough to import as a whole unit, So at least some part of it should be indigenous. This is the way they are forcing us to, develop our skills, our engineering skills, design, manufacture, inspection, maintenance. We have to develop all those.
Correct. Yeah. The downstream sector of Reliance has all those in place. I'm just talking about the upstream sector where I am more familiar with. But the downstream sector, like the Jamnagar plant or the
operating plants.
Yeah, the plants, whether it is a Nagotani plant or the Jamnagar plant. For all these, the tubular columns or whatever it is all. Everything is sourced and supplied within India.
Only the
only the subsea industry.
Subsea part, which is more tricky, I suppose. Yeah, it'll take time, but I hope it'll happen. Thank you, Nandini. Well answered. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Beena ma'am has raised the question. Beena ma'am, you can go ahead. Hello.
I asked a question already. No more questions.
Hello, Beena garu. I think you are on mute.
Hello.
Meena, I can hear you. I think Beena Neelam has raised. I think she's on mute.
Yes. Oh, okay. She rejoined.
Okay.
Nandini, you remember Beena?
No, I'm sorry.
Hey, hello. My sister Beena.
Okay. I was just wondering.
Beena garu, you are on mute.
Somebody has to okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, yes,
Yes.
yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm not a chemical engineer, but Nandini, I'm so impressed by your breadth of knowledge, not only depth in some areas, but you're able to take every question and answer at the right level. So, first of all, excellent job.
Thank you.
Um, and then Dhanush asked a very interesting question. I'm an agricultural scientist, so I'm going to piggyback on that and your answer to Dhanush's question. You said that you have like a discovery work that somebody goes in and looks at the seabed and assesses it for you. My question is that a global body or is that internal? Then is there a conflict of interest there if it's internal?
No, it is a global body and it is also a directive from the Government of India. It's called OISD Directive, Oil and Gas Industry Safety Directive. So, under this directive, before you start an oil and gas project or a E&P project in the subsea or start building anything subsea, you have to submit all your findings and your action plans and mitigative plans and how you're going to design the system to to these bodies. And this is both OISD as well as the international. I'm forgetting the name, but there's an international body where we
right?
have to submit all, and within that we also have to prove that what is the percentage of spill that like when I was talking about spills, it's not just the oil spill that goes into the subsea or the underwater into the waters. It is also when you're operating these valves, there is small amounts of hydraulic fluid that gets leaked into the system, because every time a piston goes in and out, there is some fluid that goes into the system. So all these fluids are pre-certified and are all acceptable fluids at acceptable ppms or milliliters that you can release into the subsea. And these are all identified at a very early stage. Now, since after the E&P industry or the oil and gas industry has evolved so much, these are all has already become as a standard. That a standard supplier will provide you an equipment that would not leak beyond this much. Is already defined.
Okay. And you know, the reason I'm asking this question is the company that sequenced the human genome, there was a private company. After the genome was published, the company the CEO of the company became so interested in the deep earth exploration that they found so many species that can survive at 60 degrees and more. So they are studying those genomes so that in the future, when the world heats up, we have some knowledge about how to survive extreme heat and stress. So if we go and disturb all that and we don't have that knowledge, then how do we? That was the basis of my question.
Okay.
That's also an interesting area, futuristic kind of
That's very
exploration.
interesting to know. Yes, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Interesting.
Thank you so much.
And that is where I think most of these oil and gas industries are no more trying to be an oil and gas industry, but be an energy industry and move from the conventional oil and gas to a more of a hydrogen or a solar kind of in an energy sector, and have this net carbon zero concept. Most of the oil and gas industries have announced 2050 as a target for net carbon zero. So I think it's all tying back to that, saving the environment.
Thank you, ma'am. Seems to be Apova has a question. Apova, you can go ahead.
Firstly, thank you, ma'am. This is the most awaited session we are looking for, and we just love the way you are explaining everything. So my question is like, you generally predict everything before installing the whole setup, right? So like, what are the small problems that that are never solved and will be worrying this thing always?
Okay, no, there will be. So this is not with respect to oil and gas or E&P. There will be always risk in any of the projects that you do. So risk mitigation or risk analysis and mitigation, I would say, is done at a very early stage, and you can never say that this risk will never happen. So those kind of things is very risky to say. Okay. So what happens is in risk mitigation, risk analysis, you identify the risk. You know that some of these risks can be taken care in the design stage. So you implement it into your design. Now something like sand occurring or something like a sand will start producing is a risk that you cannot predict that it is going to happen today or tomorrow. But you have a mitigation plan, meaning to say that you will have something in place that you will be able to stop an adverse event, okay, using these mitigative plans, but the risk will still exist. So if a sand, say in case of sand production, instead of the actual produced fluid, if sand is going to come into the system, okay, so what as a design, what we do, we install a sensor, and the sensor starts giving you a beep that okay, now sand is starting to flow. Can you stop the sand from flowing? No, you can't. So that is always going to be a risk. Okay, but can you manage that sand production? Yes. So some of the risk will always be there, but some of the risk can be mitigated in different stages of the design or engineering, and some of the risk will always be there. It has to be only managed. So it is managed through proper mitigation management plans, and it is a continuous cycle which the operations team have to do it. So the project team and they hand it over to the operation team. All these are also explained, or they are trained in a way to understand all these things and how these components are going to function. What does the sensor mean? What does, for the example of the sand production, so if the sensor values goes beyond this, then you know that sand is being produced. Then you have to start doing this mitigative actions before it reaches to a point that it creates an adverse effect. So alarms, signals, all these things are inbuilt into the system that will give you a way to manage it, but you cannot avoid certain risks.
And ma'am, like you said that this process is going to be completed in a span of like from December to May. So is there any chance that by improving the design or techniques, we can do it like overall throughout the year?
No, see, I'll tell you what. When I said that it has to be done between December to March, means to say that the subsea activities have to be done between December to March. That means all these lifts, all these activities, where you saw the vessels in the field, have to finish the activity within this time period, March, or it can go up to April or maybe mid-May, but not beyond that. And when I say this, it has nothing to do with technology. It is the weather conditions, the weather window that we are having in the east coast of India is only this 4 to 5 months. And in over last 100 years, record data is taken, analyzed, and that is how last 100 years I'm talking. Okay, in the last 100 years, how many times cyclones have come, at what period they have come, how many times we have seen earthquakes, even in the subsea or tsunamis, and how many times storm winds have come, and what durations. All this is taken as 100-year data. So this is nothing to do with technology or evolving technology. It is weather, climatic conditions. The weather or the trends have shown that the weather is suitable only between these periods in the east coast. Maybe somewhere else in the world, a different window could be. So that is also analyzed. And okay, in the North Sea, they have a longer period because they don't have so much of harsh weather conditions. It is the sea state or the weather as such is slightly more stable for a longer duration. So it is more to do with the weather conditions.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Veena ma'am and Shravan sir.
Thank you.
Seems to be no one has a question now. Okay. Just I want to give a comments. It was so interesting. Thank you for explaining the whole process happening in the oil show. And also those pictures were really beautiful. The way you explained us each thing so patiently, given us a beautiful picture of whole work at the background. Doing this much hard work at this young age, being a woman, being a family man, you managed everything very well, and it was so inspiring for all of us. The things you said about to develop like goal setting, skill management, team skills, business communication, networking and mentorship, and also the trick like 4 chambers, values and time management. It will help us to develop our personal skills a lot. Thank you for spending a lot of time with us and answering all these questions so patiently. Here I want to present you a gratitude card from our top cell. Thank you, Ms. Sri Nandini Nitin ma'am. Thank you, ma'am, for accepting our invitation and giving us a top talk. Your offshore journey inspired all of us. We enjoyed every second of your talk. We were enjoying and learning at the same time. Your smile is so beautiful. Thank you from the Throw Gratitude team.
Bina, I hope you have enjoyed one of our TOP sessions.
Oh, lovely. I really,
Yes, ma'am.
really want to thank all of you. You girls, I haven't seen so many engineers in the US. I don't think girls take up, they have to be continuously motivated to go into engineering, whereas you girls are already, I mean, amazing to see you guys so well, um, integrated into this whole talk and everything. Thank you for including me.
I would like Nivedita to share a gratitude card.
Quotation. So, a quotation from the Gratitude team. Life is precious. We should not take anything for granted. Living every moment as if it was the first and last is a genuine life of gratitude, acceptance, and wisdom. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was lovely.
Thank you, Nivedita. I want to say a vote of thanks. It's my privilege to propose a vote of thanks on this session. On behalf of TOP ESL, I must mention a deep sense of appreciation to our top speaker, Ms. Srinandini Nitin ma'am, and thank you Shravan sir for giving us this opportunity, and thank you Meena ma'am and Bina ma'am for giving a part and having spending a time with us. And I also thank my seniors, juniors, and my friends for making it more interactive. Have a good day, all.
Bye.